for those of you who were not in our class, my name is Mario.
I'm Tess.
And it's our honor to welcome you to the first talk of the year for the Friday lecture series, which is supported by the Transatlantic Master's Program and the Center for European Studies here at UNC.
Dr. Rahsaan Maxwell is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science here at Chapel Hill. In fact, he is Mario and my, along with other TAM students, current professor for a course called Immigrant Integration in Contemporary Western Europe. The title of that course epitomizes Dr. Maxwell's research, which examines the politics of integration for ethnic, racial, religious, and immigrant origin minorities with a particular focus on Western Europe. His book, titled Ethnic Minority Migrants in Britain and France, Integration Trade-Offs, examines the effect that social integration has in the group mobilization capacity of different migrant groups and how this trade-off can impact their economic and political integration as well. As an African American who grew up in the vastly diverse environment of New York City, this book represents Professor Maxwell's lifelong interest to grapple with issues of racial and ethnic relations.
So today he will be presenting his soon-to-be published paper, What Makes Muslims Feel French, which explores the extent to which religiosity has an influence on the French Muslim identity. In light of recent events in France, like the Gaza protest and the rise of the right-wing Front National Party, which is headed by Marine Le Pen, who holds rather antagonistic views and attitudes towards Islam and French Muslims, this should be a particularly interesting lecture that addresses a topic that merits wider discussion. We think that Professor Maxwell's research and conclusions about immigrant integration highlight the importance of comprehensively examining an issue, avoiding historically negative or pessimistic attitudes when considering immigrants' integration, and most importantly, listening to their opinions, feelings, and attitudes. Oftentimes the reality of integration in Western societies is much different than what is represented in the mainstream media. So please join me in welcoming Professor Maxwell.
Thank you for that very comprehensive introduction. So, as you are aware, CES organizes these weekly speaker series for you, and it's organized into modules. And so the module that I'm organizing is about immigration. And so this is the first one. September 26th, you will have another UNC professor, Susan Pennybacker, who will speak about the history of British immigration, history of immigrants in Britain. She's a history professor. And then November 21st, we're going to have someone from George Washington. His name is Harris Milonis, and he specializes in diaspora policies and policies for return migration, with a particular focus on Greece and that part of the world. So he has a number of exciting things, so we look forward to all of that. For today, I want to talk about an article that I have coming out. It's, I guess you've all seen the short op-ed that we wrote in the middle discussion that it generated. It's with a colleague of mine from Middlebury, Eric Bleich. So the broad topic, which everyone here agrees is both interesting and important, is immigrant integration in Europe. And for those of you who were in my class, I already gave an overview, but I just wanted to start by framing it for those who may or may not have the same background in these things. And the background is that migration was a part of Europe and all Western societies really kicking off in the late 19th century at the time when industrialization was getting bigger. And so countries that were getting more industrialized needed more labor. And people from the poorer countries began moving to the richer countries. Basically, they were moving from Southern and Eastern Europe to Western and Northern Europe and to the United States. So all the Italians that we got here were also going to France and the UK. But things changed after World War II. And after World War II, when Europe was destroyed, both physically, the buildings were all gone, and the people were all gone, so they needed to rebuild those buildings, and they didn't have enough people to do it. So they began recruiting migrants. They started by looking for European migrants, both those Southern and Eastern Europeans that they had previously gotten, but that soon wasn't enough, and they began to look beyond Europe. And that's when the population changed. So in the beginning, this group was there for economic purposes, as perhaps many of you know. They were mainly there seen as short-term source of labor for economic rebuilding. But in the 1980s and beyond, it became clear they were going to be a permanent population. And so now, if they're going to be permanent, we have to wonder about how are they integrating into the economic society, the cultural issues, and the political system. So how are they going to do more than just work in a factory? And in addition, the question is, will they integrate the way the previous migrants did 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago, since they're not from Europe? And so in this broader landscape of immigrant integration being a big challenge and a new challenge, a potentially new challenge, Muslim integration is seen as particularly challenging or particularly important to understand these days. In part, it's because there are so many supposed cultural and ideological differences. It's not just a difference of Italians and French, but they're coming from further away, different lifestyles, different ways of viewing the treatment of women you hear about, the treatment of homosexuals, the treatment of children, all these things that are supposedly different. In addition, many of them are coming from countries that were formerly colonized. So you have these post-colonial tensions. We just fought a war of independence, and now I'm going to come live next to you. It can lead to a lot of challenges. And of course, in recent years, there are the Muslim extremists, and then the response, the global war on terror, has created a lovely cocktail of tension for lots of people. So, in the backdrop for that whole issue of what's going on with Muslims, how are they integrating, what's going on, our question for this particular paper is just one piece of that. And the one piece we're looking at is their national identity. So to what extent do they consider themselves, in this case, French? And that's important because, again, there are lots of ways you can understand Muslim integration. This is only one, but it's one that speaks to this question of loyalty and allegiance. Because part of the big fear, both in relation to the post-colonial and their homeland countries, and also to their global religious affiliation, is that they're not seen as really committed to France or whatever European country they're in. They're seen as maybe they have allegiance to other identities, and they don't really consider themselves part of Europe. And that's a big worry. In addition, beyond that, just on a daily basis, if you're not sure if someone's really feeling connected to your country, then there might be a lack of social cohesion. So in your daily life, you don't really feel you can trust this person, you don't really feel they don't have your best interest at heart. It leads to a lot of tension, potentially erupting in the kinds of things that Mario was talking about that we've seen recently. People disagree and can't settle it peacefully and get into violent protests. Now, these issues exist all over Europe, and France is just one country. And so we're focusing on Muslims in France. It's a particularly important population. It's the largest Muslim population in Europe, roughly 5 million people. It's also been the site of these intense debates dating back 25 years, talking about the headscarf, the importance of veil. So it's been an ongoing issue of what's going on. Do they have the right to wear these different religious things? And it's gone through many cycles. So it's a very intense situation. On the one hand, there are people who claim that people are screaming about Islam as the solution for France. They want to take over France. They want to impose their wild and extreme views. On the other hand, people like this picture on our right are saying, can't I be French and Muslim at the same time? Is there a way that I can practice my religion and also be French? And it's not clear, how extreme people really are, how they can be French. A lot of issues going on. How does this practice fit in ways that are acceptable both to non-Muslim French people and to this new Muslim immigrant minority? And this is made even more challenging by the French tradition of laïcité, which, as perhaps all of you know, is the notion that religion should be, the official state should be neutral with regards to religion, and that religious identities and religious practices are not relevant for public life. Of course, this dates back, as they're all too fond of pointing out, well before Muslims were even in the picture. It was related to the Catholic Church and its threat to the nation. And so Muslims are perhaps a new challenge to that tradition. So Muslims in France are a particularly interesting and challenging case. So there are a number of ways of generating, a number of hypotheses that we could generate about when Muslims are more or less likely to identify as French. Now the standard way that most people see it is that when they are more religious, they're less likely to be French, less likely to feel French. The logic here is that when Muslims are very attached to their religion and very practicing, very observant, they're going to be more attached to that as a concept and less attached to France, because France is not compatible with the notion of being an observant Muslim who cares about religious identity. So that's the dominant way of seeing it, that the only good French Muslims are those who don't practice and don't really consider themselves Muslim. But one of our goals in this paper, and in general, it's one of the broader trends, is to say, well, just because these people are technically Muslim doesn't mean that religion is the only way of understanding their lives. So I'm technically a man, and you're technically a woman. That doesn't mean that those gender identities control everything that we do at all points in time. We may also decide to do things because we're a father or a sister or whatever. So there are a number of different identities, as we all know, that shape how we act and behave. And so this allows us to formulate other hypotheses. And so one that comes around is that maybe it's not a question of their religion, but their socioeconomic status. Because many of them are socioeconomically disadvantaged, and many of them arrived without a good education, so that could be driving their integration outcomes. And if they were to get good socioeconomic outcomes, maybe then they would feel more connected to society, and therefore the socioeconomically successful Muslims are the ones who may feel more French. And so that perspective looks at them as a class group, if you will. Oh, and feel free to interrupt at any point in time. Question, comment. So, interestingly enough, there is actually a flip side to this, which shows, not necessarily based in France, but general literature on the relationship between socioeconomic status and national identification shows that in some cases actually better SES leads to less less national identification, because people like us who are well educated don't need that, corny, small-minded national identity stuff. Not to offend anyone, but there is some literature that sort of hints at that. So another way of looking at it is that the less educated Muslims are the ones who might cling to a national identity, and the more educated might view themselves as individuals. Another perspective looks at them less as a class group and less as a religious group, and more as a segregated ethnic minority. So they're living in these certain types of neighborhoods with other immigrants who also may be segregated from the mainstream French population. And therefore the question is, if they're mainly hanging around with Muslims and immigrants, then they're not going to feel French. Not because they're religious, and not because they're poor, just because they're trapped in this segregated environment. And so this says that Muslims are mainly some sort of ethnic group that is separated from the mainstream native French. So therefore, the more that they live and socialize with other minorities, the less likely they are to feel French. And then finally, our argument is that they should be viewed as an immigrant group. So the Muslims, 99%, not including those converts, either are immigrants or children of immigrants. And this process of arriving in a new country and adapting to a new country's norms are actually the dominant way of shaping their identity in this case, irrespective of their religion, their class, or their segregation. And so if this is true, people who are born in French should be more likely to feel French. When they have citizenship, they're going to be more likely to feel French. And if they're fluent in the language, they're more likely to feel French. All of which might seem pretty intuitive, I hope so. But the point there is that this sets Muslims in, this sets the analysis of Muslims in a different perspective. It says they're part of this immigrant integration trajectory, which may actually be very different from all the other immigrants. And they're not necessarily a special case of these religiously incompatible people. And that they're just immigrants who will integrate over time. So those are the hypotheses that we explore. Now, how does one explore them? So, as many people know, the data in France are not as plentiful as in other countries. In part, that's because there are legal limitations and that the official government data cannot ask you about your ethnicity or your religion. Official government meaning mandatory surveys like the census. They can run optional ones, but mandatory data will not ask that. There are also cultural taboos. So you can run your own surveys. I run my own surveys in France, but there are cultural taboos about asking these questions. So on the one hand, French researchers are just not likely to do it. And then even if they do it, they have to ask the questions in certain ways that make the data less plentiful than in other countries. So there's less data on these issues, which means we know less about how these people feel and think than we do for other countries. Now luckily, thanks to some hard work and long fights from a variety of French scholars, there was a survey, the Trajectoire Origine, fielded from late September to early February 2009. And it was focused on immigrant populations and immigrants of non-European origin. So they had a wonderful sample size of over 20,000 people, of which almost 6,000 identified as Muslim. So it's a very good source of data, admittedly cross-sectional, but it's a very good source of survey data for people who want to study a wide range of issues. Now, the question about, we identify Muslims from a question about, I forget the exact wording, but very broad, would you consider yourself connected to a religion? Something along those lines. And so, nonetheless, so when we think that's good because it doesn't tap into anything about how often do you practice or anything like that. It's a very broad, and within that, as I'll show you later, there's a range of practice. But nonetheless, given the French condition, it's likely that some people who might consider themselves Muslims in the absolute chose not to identify themselves as Muslim in the survey because of the stigma of being associated with it. Therefore, it's likely that our sample is biased towards the high identifiers, people who were willing to pass over that slightly taboo moment of identifying yourself as a Muslim. However, in many respects, that only strengthens our results, because our results, as you can imagine, are that religiosity is not the most important driver of French identification. So if we were to get the full sample of Muslims who would be even less identified than those we have here, that would only strengthen our findings. We can talk more about the various potential sources of bias, if you like, later. So this is a basic overview of the, I see the colors are not as evocative as one might like. A basic overview of our main question, which is, I feel French. And this is our main dependent variable. And there are 4 response categories: completely agree, somewhat disagree, completely disagree. And on the far left, you have Muslims, then you have immigrant origin non-Muslims, and native origin non-Muslims. And as you would expect, the bottom is the most positive category. So as you would expect, Muslims are less positive than non-Muslims. And among non-Muslims, the native origin non-Muslims are more positive, they're more French than the immigrant origin non-Muslims. So that conforms with what people expect. However, it's worth noting that almost 50% of Muslims completely agree. And if you combine the 2 positive categories, 75% of Muslims have a positive connection to France. So clearly there are issues with any public opinion survey, social desirability bias, but 3/4 of them are responding positively to this, which leads us to think that there's no widespread alienation an initial indication of just laying the landscape for how they feel about France. But we want to see the predictors and what might explain these differences. For what it's worth, we also looked at a number of other potential dependent variables, such as I feel at home in France, and other people see me as French, and the results were the same. So we started by estimating regression models. We grouped the 4 explanations: religiosity, socioeconomic status, segregation, and immigrant integration. We had 3 or 4 indicators of each one. And so we grouped them into latent variables just to simplify it for the purposes of presentation. But we also did the analysis by each individual indicator. But again, for the simplification purposes of presentation, these are just for the combined latent variables. And so you can see religiosity is negatively associated with feeling French, as expected. Socioeconomic status is positively associated with feeling French, as was expected. Social network segregation is negatively, so the more segregated you are, the less you are likely to feel French. And immigrant integration is positively associated, so the more integrated you are, if you have citizenship, speak the language, and were born in the country, the more you are likely to feel French. So this confirms pretty much all the hypotheses that they are directionally pointing in the way we expected, except for that slightly odd one about educated people being too cool for nationality. So that's the basic result. But we might want to see which relationship is stronger, and of course logistic coefficients are not easy to interpret. So you calculate the predicted probabilities, and you do this from going from the bottom quartile to the top quartile of the latent variable. So essentially, the religiosity one shows that going from low religiosity to high religiosity decreases the likelihood of feeling French by about 13%. I can't read it exactly. So there is an effect. Religiosity does decrease the likelihood of feeling French. However, you can see with your rough eyes that immigrant integration has the largest effect. So whereas that is only a decrease in 13%, that's an increase of almost 40% as you go from non-integrated to highly integrated on those immigrant integration variables. So this is telling us that all these things matter. We're not trying to say that religion's unimportant, networks are unimportant, education's unimportant, but immigrant integration appears to be the most important and perhaps the dominant way of looking at Muslim identity in France. Good. Now, you might want to look a little bit more closely across sex, because there's a lot of ways in which Islam, the experience of Islam, is not the same for men and women. So it might also affect how they feel French. Here we see the rough overview of how likely they are to feel French, and actually there isn't much of a difference between men and women. Men and women have this, Muslims have the same likelihood, same responses across that, and when we broke down the other analysis, they also had the same relationships between religiosity and immigrant integration and so on and so forth. So sex is not such a big issue for this particular question. National origin, of course, is another possibility. We know there's different experiences depending on whether you come from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Turkey. And we see here, as you might expect for those who know a little bit about France, that the Maghrebians are the most likely of these groups. They have the highest positive responses. Sub-Saharan Africans have less, and Turks have even less. They're the ones that weren't colonized, have less of a connection. So there are some differences in the overall level of feeling French, but no differences in those relationships. So among each of these groups, religiosity is important, but less important than immigrant integration. And all the details are in the paper for those who love this stuff. Hopefully. So this is not, it's not a case of Maghrebians driving the story and it not working for others. Among all these subgroups, religiosity is associated with less identification, but immigrant integration is the biggest factor. So to summarize thus far, religiosity is associated with less positive French identification, but immigrant integration is the strongest predictor of Muslim identification. We also tried this with other indicators and it all came out the same. So the next step is to compare it with other groups. So if immigrant integration really is the most important way of understanding Muslim identification, then perhaps that can explain some of those gaps between Muslims and other groups and how likely they are to feel French. And perhaps other groups should, if these are more general dynamics, other groups should exhibit the same trend. So we start with Christians. And so for Christians, we see the same dynamic. Two things are interesting here. And these are, again, the change in the predicted probability of feeling French across the minimum to the maximum levels of each of these concepts. And so two things are interesting here. One is that religiosity is associated with less French identification among Christians as well. So it's not just that Muslims are being moved away from France by their religion, it happens for Christians as well. The other huge difference is that immigrant integration, again, is more important among Christians than religiosity, SES, or networks for explaining when Christians feel French. So this is a general dynamic where connection to the nation is driven by immigrant integration and not religiosity. We have a number of potential hypotheses about why Christians are less likely to feel religious. We checked whether this, and this also exists among immigrant origin Christians, or also have a negative relationship and more for immigrant integration. Among Western origin Christians, so Christians from Europe, same thing, and Christians from outside of Europe. The most plausible thing, well, we looked to see if there was a difference between Protestant and Catholic origin immigrants, because perhaps Protestants were less likely to feel French, either because of some long-going tension within Europe, or just a general lack of connection to the French Catholic society. But that did not make a difference, so whether you were a Protestant or Catholic origin did not make a difference. Our best guess is that, as I said before, the French nation is founded on not being religious, so you can be religious, but that's not part of the national identity in the same way. So therefore, to the extent that you are strongly identified with a religion, it might be associated with less of a primal connection to the nation, but this is speculation. But again, the most important thing from these is that even among Christians, religiosity is associated with less French, so it's not just Muslims, and among Christians, immigrant integration appears to be driving the story. So it appears to be a more general dynamic. Now, what accounts for these overall differences? As I said, Muslims are less likely to feel French than other groups. So once you account for immigrant integration, does that take care of the story? So to do that, non-Muslims are more positive than Muslims. But to do this, we estimated a series of models where we use dummy variables for the Muslim-non-Muslim difference. And these are the coefficients, which don't actually tell you much, but the point is the comparison of how the coefficient changes across models. So in the base model, there's no covariate except for the dummy variable, Muslim-non-Muslim. And so that base model is telling you that becoming Muslim, so Muslim to Muslim is coded as 1, means you're less likely to identify as French. And then as we add additional covariates, therefore controlling for more forms of variation, to what extent is that Muslim-non-Muslim difference changing? So in each case, these are the coefficients for the dummy variable. And what we can see is that once you add variables for religiosity, the Muslim-non-Muslim difference remains the same. The only real change in the Muslim-non-Muslim difference comes once you add the variables for immigrant integration. It still doesn't go away. So the Muslims are still different from the non-Muslims, but there's the greatest reduction in the difference once you control for immigrant integration. So this suggests that, again, immigrant integration is not the only thing that matters. We would have loved to see that, but we're not going to go that far out because it probably doesn't accord with reality. But it accounts for more of the difference than those other typical variables. And the same thing among immigrant origin non-Muslims. Here, the baseline is different because once everyone has immigrant origins, there's not as much of a difference between Muslims and non-Muslims. And so that is intuitive. Christians versus Muslims. Again, here we see by far the biggest difference between Christians and Muslims is once you control for immigrant integration and not the others. Immigrant origin Christians, again, the overall differences are smaller, but similar trend. Western origin Christians, non-Western origin Christians. So the point here is that, yes, Muslims are less likely to feel French than non-Muslims. Okay, fine. Yes, Muslim religiosity is associated with less positive French identification. Yes, we understand. But let's not go too far. Most Muslims do have positive French identification, for whatever that's worth, and depending on your questions, comments, interests, we can talk about that. And we find it very compelling that immigrant integration appears to be the most important way of understanding this. Again, as I said, it suggests that when you look at Muslims, it's not just about their religion. You can't explain everything through the extent to which they want to observe some religious practices. They are, as Mario said, more complex than that, as we all are. And so, beyond that, looking forward, if you think about it, citizenship, country of birth, and language fluency are already positive and likely to improve even more, which therefore suggests a somewhat even more optimistic picture of the Muslim identification with France in the future, because they're going to be increasingly born in France and less likely to be immigrants, and therefore more likely to be citizens and fluent in the language. Now, of course, this is one study, one survey. We're not trying to extrapolate too far here. A lot of events can occur that make things more complicated, not to mention the host society itself has a role to play in this. But for what it's worth, we find these results very compelling and very interesting. So that's that. And yeah, a broader question might be, to what extent do these dynamics exist in other countries? I mean, I've done work on the importance of immigrant integration for understanding these attitudes across Europe. You could imagine that they might be more important in France than other countries because of this real focus on the civic community, but that's an open question ready to be researched. So, thank you.